Let's go overseas now, because there has been talks in Geneva for many weeks now between Iran and the US, and this is over doing some kind of nuclear deal. Well, those talks have wrapped up. There's no breakthrough there. They say good progress is being made, but at the same time, the US continues to send warships and jets to the Middle East. So what does that say about where this is all headed? There were question marks about Trump's temperament and what he might do in international conflicts when he did take on the presidency 2.0. Joining me live now is Mike Pezzullo. We're going to get into a bit of that now. He's a former Home Affairs Secretary. Good to see you, Mike, once again. I think this is really important to look at what's happening with Iran now. He did that, what we thought was a one-and-done strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, but of course there's still a lot of activity in that region. Trump was elected the second time around with this kind of America First push. They thought that he wouldn't get involved in these international conflicts, but that hasn't been the case at all.
Good morning, Laura. No, indeed it hasn't been, and you could be excused living here in Australia perhaps not to be paying a lot of attention to this. Obviously, international affairs experts are, and obviously Iranian Australians certainly are, because of what's happening back in their homeland country. But obviously we've been consumed here post-Bondi, the establishment of the Royal Commission, what's happening with the ISIS brides question. So, look, this might be at the margin, at the edge of our consciousness, but it's a really important issue in terms of world affairs, and it's going to have some direct implications for Australia, which I'll get to in a moment. But to the kernel of your question, I think there was a misunderstanding about what America First meant. I think in the first term we saw signs of this. We're certainly seeing signs of it more so in the second Trump term. America First does not mean America isolated. What it does mean is America using its tremendous strategic power, its military power, its financial leverage, the fact that it can impose sanctions, the fact that it can undertake military strikes seemingly almost at will around the world. I think Trump is rebranding or reshaping, is the better word, I should say, American power. I think, however, this potentially gets to the upper limit of what he can do, if you will, in terms of America alone. They're not relying much on other allies and partners. There's probably some dependence on the UK in terms of potentially staging through Diego Garcia and perhaps through the base in Cyprus. And there appears to be very close coordination with the Israelis. But the Americans don't seem to be relying on anyone else, because they're using their forces that are at sea or deployable through the air. What it does show, I think, is the hardest case for the hardest challenge for American military power, short of a war with, say, North Korea, Russia or China, which would be the three more difficult challenges. America would have to rely on collaboration with its allies were that to happen. But this is probably the hardest nut to crack in terms of America largely projecting military force on its own. I actually don't think, and you and I have talked about this for the past year or so, I don't think people should be surprised at how adventurous President Trump is, but people seem to be getting surprised all the time whenever he does this.
The opportunity to change the power dynamics in the Middle East as well. And so far, we can see that happening. There's the Board of Peace, there's the ceasefire in Gaza. Iran, of course, was a proxy funding Hamas for quite some time. I assume they still are. Then we saw the bombing of those nuclear sites, this massive military presence in the Middle East for the past couple of weeks. I mean, that all is undercutting Iran's ability to create mischief, as it has done.
Yeah, exactly right. And this virtually unilateral, I say virtually unilateral because, as I've just mentioned, they are reliant on some key allies and partners, but let's call it largely a unilateral exercise in American power, or the projection of American power. I think the President and his administration see this as a generational opportunity to completely reshape the Middle East, and I agree with all the factors you've just laid out, so I won't repeat them all. If you can have a diminished Iran, potentially not under a changed political regime, I think that's an open question about whether that can be achieved, or in fact whether it's even an essential goal that the Americans are pursuing, but certainly a diminished Iran, perhaps a fractured Iran, a demoralised Iran, where potentially fractures might start to emerge within the regime, I think very much is the US game plan. You see this incredible realignment in a very short period of time between the US and Syria, for instance. We've talked about that because that's relevant to the closure of those camps where the so-called ISIS brides are being detained. 2 years ago, it would have been unthinkable for the Americans to be in a strategic partnership of sorts with Syria. They are. A lot of the Iranian proxies have either been neutralised or are certainly keeping quiet. And indeed, if the Board of Peace just focused on its Gaza objective, leaving aside whatever else it might be attempting to achieve, if it can actually bring that demilitarisation and disarmament of Hamas and start that economic reconstruction, whether it's a Palestinian state or not, put that to one side for the moment, that is historical. Like if that can be pulled off, and neutering Iran is essential to that, if nothing else, Trump will be remembered for reshaping the Middle East, which, I mean, who would have written about that before the first Trump term and before the second Trump term? I don't think people would have had that in contemplation, frankly.
No, he's adventurous and unpredictable. We can add that to the list, absolutely. Mike, I mean, he did promise that help was coming to those tens of thousands of young people that took to the streets, tens of thousands of which have died. We haven't spoken about that for quite some time. A lot of people urging military action, not just negotiations on the nuclear facilities. So what is the likelihood that we still see that military action, given all those assets are in the region, in the next couple of weeks?
Look, Laura, I think regime change from the air or from the sea is very hard. Yes, if they do undertake strikes, and I think there's probably a 50-50 chance that they will undertake some form of strike, whether it's connected nominally to the nuclear negotiations. As you say, there's been a round that's concluded in Geneva overnight. We don't really have a readout. I actually don't think that's only a nominal, if you like, cause or reason for this military action. I think the military action is all about putting pressure on Tehran for all the reasons we've just discussed. But gosh, regime change in a country as large as Iran, with the extent to which it's militarised, the security forces are everywhere, they are brutal. I think realistically, the best prospect for regime change is for the regime itself to start to fracture. In other words, security forces turn on security forces, forces that were previously loyal to the regime, particularly to the Ayatollahs and to the Supreme Leader himself, start to peel off. Very hard to design a bombing campaign and a missile strike campaign to achieve that effect. It might have an effect though, Laura, if they take out not just military sites, say air defence sites or radar sites, airfields, but they start attacking, for instance, the headquarters buildings of the Quds Force, of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, of the various ministries. It might well start to create fractures in the regime where some might say, look, we can't take this punishment anymore. Others, the Ayatollahs particularly, will say, no, we have to ride this out. We're going to retaliate brutally. We're going to activate sleeper cells all around the world. We're going to strike targets in the Middle East in order to fend the Americans off. I think one thing, though, you can be sure about, Laura, whatever happens is likely to be short, sharp and violent. Why is that? The Americans are operating at a very high tempo. You can fatigue very quickly. They don't have a lot of depth. They're trying to conserve munitions. The missile interceptors, for instance, are very expensive and they don't have a lot of them. And the Iranians probably have been building drones and one-way kamikaze drones in sites that perhaps are not entirely known. We know the Americans will use every tool at their disposal, including some of their rather magical weapons that the President has hinted to, weapons that only the Americans have to get past the countermeasures that they are likely to encounter. So if it happens in the next week or so, and the reason why we can start to talk in those terms is that the crescendo or the tempo of operations is such that it's going to be very, very hard to sustain those forces at sea and those forces at those high levels of readiness very hard. I think if regime change happens, it'll be a byproduct, collateral, if you will, of what a striking campaign is designed to achieve, which is to degrade their military capability. But it might well be that the president has given a direction that he wants to strike political targets as well, such as ministries. And if that happens, it might well be that the Iranian regime starts to fracture and you start to see regime forces fighting them amongst each other as those forces fracture, because regimes like this can really only be kept in power through the consent, if you like, of the security forces, because they protect the regime. If those security forces themselves start to fracture, you might start to see quite dramatic political change in Iran.
As you say, Mike, short, sharp and violent. Thanks so much for your insight today. Really appreciate it.